Hotel staff mocked me for being disabled, not knowing I owned their entire company. And I want to tell you about the 4 hours between check-in and the moment I revealed who I was. I am 53. I have been a wheelchair user for the past 18 years, following a spinal cord injury in a car accident. I am also the founder and majority owner of a hospitality company that owns approximately 140 hotels across the United States and Europe. The company had grown from a single bed and breakfast I had founded 30 years ago. The thing that brought me to one of my own hotels was specific. I had been doing periodic anonymous quality checks at our properties for the past 10 years. The hotel I had been visiting was one of our flagship properties. The hotel had been priced at about $700 a night. The check-in had been the first sign. The front desk had been staffed by 2 women. One had been a woman named Brielle. Brielle had been about 25. Brielle said, "Are you sure you can manage? Our rooms are not all accessible. Let me see what we have available." I said, "I had booked an accessible room." Brielle said, "Let me check." Brielle then turned to her colleague. Brielle said in a voice she had thought was quiet, "Another wheelchair. I am not dealing with this. You take her." The colleague had taken over. The colleague had checked me in. I had been in my room about an hour later when the second sign happened. I had called the front desk to ask about a malfunctioning thermostat. About an hour later, I had heard knocking. The maintenance worker had been there. The maintenance worker said, "This is the 4th time today I have been called for a wheelchair guest. You people are exhausting." I had been processing the fact that the maintenance worker had felt comfortable saying this to a guest in our flagship property. I made a phone call. I called my chief operating officer. My COO was a man named Bradford. Bradford had been with the company for 15 years. I told Bradford what had been happening. Bradford said, "I will send a team." I said, "No, I am going to handle this myself." After I hung up with Bradford, I did not immediately call for the general manager. I sat in my hotel room and I just thought, 2 separate employees in the same property felt comfortable being cruel to a disabled guest within the same afternoon. That is not a coincidence. That is a culture. And if I was going to address this the right way, I needed more than my own experience. I wheeled myself out of my room, took the elevator down to the lobby, and I found a spot near the seating area across from the front desk where I could just watch. It took about 15 minutes before a couple walked up to check in. They were maybe in their 30s, both standing, both able-bodied. Brielle was the one who helped them. The difference was so clear it made my chest hurt. Brielle was smiling. Brielle was laughing. She leaned forward on the counter like she was genuinely happy to see them. She said, "Welcome. We are so glad to have you. Let me get you all set up." Same desk, same employee. Completely different person depending on whether the guest in front of her was standing or sitting. After a few minutes, I wheeled myself over toward the concierge area. I asked the young man behind the desk a simple question. He smiled and started talking, but while he was answering, his eyes kept flicking over my shoulder toward the front desk. He was glancing at Brielle, like he was aware of where she was. I had managed people for 30 years. I knew what it looked like when an employee was performing friendliness while being watched by someone whose opinion they were afraid of. Brielle was not just rude. Brielle had social power on that team. I called Bradford again. I said, "I need you to pull the employee files for this property. All of them. Front desk, maintenance, management." Bradford said, "Let me send a team down there." I cut him off. I said, "Bradford, I need to see what happens when the owner is sitting right in front of them and they do not know it." Bradford went quiet. Then he said, "I will have everything you need within the hour." While I was waiting, I got hungry. I called room service. The food came about 30 minutes later. The delivery person was polite but in a rush. As he was putting the tray on the desk, he said something that stopped me cold. He said, "Sorry for the wait. It has been busy tonight." And I had to figure out which room this was going to because someone downstairs said the wheelchair in 412 probably needed extra napkins or something. He laughed a little. The wheelchair in 412, not the guest in 412, the wheelchair. He finished setting up the tray and I smiled and thanked him. The second that door closed, I grabbed the notepad and I wrote down his exact words. About 40 minutes later, Bradford called me back. His voice sounded different now, heavier. He said, "I pulled the complaint records for this property going back 18 months. There have been 3 disability-related complaints filed in the past year. All 3 were logged by guests who reported rude or dismissive behavior from staff. All 3 were marked as resolved by the general manager." I said, "Resolved how?" Bradford said, "That is the problem. There is no record of any follow-up, no disciplinary notes, no written warnings. The files just say resolved and that is it." Caroline signed off on all 3 of them. I felt something shift inside me. Caroline was the general manager. Caroline was the person who had received complaints from 3 separate guests about disability discrimination and had done nothing. The rot was bigger than Brielle. Brielle did not wake up one day and decide to be this way at work. Brielle learned she could be this way at work because nobody ever stopped her, and the person whose job it was to stop her had signed off on it 3 times. I picked up the hotel phone and called the front desk. Brielle answered. I said, "Hi, this is room 412. Could I get some extra towels brought up, please?" Brielle said, "I will see if someone can bring those up. We are short-staffed." I waited. 15 minutes passed. 20, 30, 45 minutes passed. No towels. I called the front desk again. This time a different voice answered. The voice was warm. She said, "Front desk, this is Bonnie. How can I help you?" I said, "Hi Bonnie, this is room 412. I called about 45 minutes ago and asked for some extra towels, but they never came." Bonnie said, "Oh my gosh, I am so sorry about that. I was not told about any towel request. Let me bring those up to you right now." Not 10 minutes later, there was a knock on my door, and Bonnie was standing there with a stack of towels and a real smile on her face. I had a decision to make. I could pick up the phone right then and call Caroline and end this whole thing. Part of me wanted to, but a bigger part of me needed to see something first. I needed to see how Caroline handled a disability complaint when it came from a regular guest, not from the owner. I called the front desk one more time. I said, "I would like to speak with the manager on duty, please." About 15 minutes later, there was a knock. Caroline was standing in the hallway with a polite smile. She sat down in the chair near the window. I told her what had happened. I told her about the check-in experience, about the comments, about the thermostat call, about the towels that never came. I kept my voice calm. I framed it the way any guest would. Caroline listened. She nodded. Then she said, "I am so sorry about that. I will absolutely speak with the team." That was it. She did not ask me which employees I had interacted with. She did not pull out a notebook. She did not ask me to describe what was said. Then she said, "I would love to offer you a complimentary complimentary dinner at our restaurant tonight as a gesture of goodwill. There it was. The pattern. Guest reports a problem. Caroline says sorry. Caroline offers a free meal. Caroline does not investigate. Caroline does not document. Caroline marks it resolved. I smiled at her. I said, "Thank you, Caroline. I really appreciate that." She walked out, and I just sat there. I did not move for a long time. The guests who had filed those 3 complaints before me, they probably sat in rooms just like this one and had the exact same conversation with Caroline and got the exact same offer and thought that was the best they were going to get. I picked up my phone and called Bradford. I said, "I am going to need you here by morning. Bring the HR director." Bradford said, "Are you sure you do not want to handle this through the normal channels?" I said, "Bradford, the normal channels are what let this happen. I will be the channel." I had accepted Caroline's offer of a complimentary dinner, not because I wanted it, but because it put me in the restaurant where I could keep watching. I wheeled myself down to the hotel restaurant around 7:30. The host greeted me and looked down at my wheelchair. There were at least 4 window tables open. He did not offer me any of them. Instead, he said, "I have a spot for you in the back. Nice and out of the way so you will have plenty of room." He walked me to a table near the back corner, partially blocked by a wide pillar. There was a service corridor just on the other side of the pillar. 2 employees had stopped in that corridor, maybe 5 or 6 feet from where I was sitting. They were on break. One of them laughed and said, "Did you see the wheelchair lady is back in the lobby again?" The other one said, "Yeah. Brielle told me she tried to get Bonnie to take the whole check-in because she did not want to deal with it." They both laughed. I set the fork down slowly. I was not angry. I had been angry earlier. This was different. This was the feeling of something clicking into place. The rot was not in one person. It was in the air. It was in the way the wheelchair lady had become a punchline in the service corridor of a hotel that charged $700 a night. I finished my water. I did not finish my food. I wheeled myself back to my room. I wheeled into the bathroom and I stopped in front of the mirror. I looked at myself for a long time. I thought about 30 years. I thought about the bed and breakfast where all of this started. I thought about how I had made sure every single person who walked through that door felt like they mattered. And then I thought about something I had not let myself think about before. I thought about why I had been doing these anonymous visits for 10 years. I had always told myself it was about quality control. But standing there in that bathroom, I had to ask myself a harder question. Was I hiding behind the anonymity because it was good business? Or was I hiding because I was afraid of exactly this? Afraid that if I showed up as myself, as the owner, as the woman in the wheelchair, people would see the chair before they saw me. I had built something big and real and mine, and some part of me had been afraid to stand in front of it because I was not sure the people inside it would see me the way I needed to be seen. I picked up my phone and I called Bart. Bart was someone I trusted on a personal level. I told him everything. I said, "I keep thinking maybe I am overreacting." Bart was quiet, then he said, "You built a company that is supposed to welcome everyone. You showed up as a guest and they made you feel like a problem. That is not overreacting. That is the whole point." I said, "I am not hiding tomorrow." Bart said, "Good." I did not sleep well, but when the alarm went off at 6 in the morning, I was already awake. I showered, I got dressed, and I put on the blazer. I had packed it the way I always packed one for these anonymous visits, just in case. In all my years of doing these visits, I had never once put the blazer on. Today I pulled it off the hanger and put it on, and looked at myself in the mirror and I did not see a woman in a wheelchair. I saw the woman who built the building I was sitting in. I wheeled myself down to the lobby early. At 7:50, Bradford walked through the front doors. The HR director was with him. At 8 o'clock, Brielle walked in through the staff entrance. I watched her clock in, and then I watched her look across the lobby and see me. Her expression did this thing. It was not surprise. It was this little flicker of annoyance, like she had just noticed a stain on the carpet that she thought had already been cleaned up. I picked up my phone and called Bradford. I said, "Bring Caroline to the conference room. It is time." I wheeled myself to the head of the table. Bradford sat to my right. The HR director sat to my left. A few minutes later, the door opened and Caroline walked in. She was expecting a corporate meeting. Then she saw me. She said, "I do not understand." I said my full name. I said my title. I said I was the founder and majority owner of the company that owned the building she was standing in. Caroline's mouth opened. Then it closed. She pulled out a chair and sat down without anyone asking her to. I walked her through everything. I told her what Brielle had said to me. I told her about the maintenance worker. I told her about the room service employee who repeated Brielle's words about the wheelchair in 412. I told her about the complimentary dinner she had offered me instead of doing anything real. Caroline said, "I did not know about the comments. I would have handled it." I reached across the table and slid 3 file folders toward her. The complaint files Bradford had pulled, 3 disability-related complaints in the past year, all marked resolved. I said, "You did handle it. You marked them resolved and moved on." Caroline looked down at the files. She did not open them. Then Bradford stepped out and brought Brielle in. Brielle walked through the door and stopped. She saw Caroline at the table. She saw me, the wheelchair guest from yesterday, sitting at the head of the table. I asked her to describe how she had handled my check-in. Brielle straightened up and said, "I checked her in. It was normal." I said, "You told your colleague, another wheelchair, I am not dealing with this. You take her." Brielle's face went completely still. She said, "I did not say that." Bradford stepped out again and brought Bonnie in. Bonnie confirmed she had heard the comment. Brielle turned to Bonnie and said, "You are seriously doing this to me right now?" Bonnie said, "I am just telling the truth." Brielle turned back to me. She said, "I do not know who you are, but you are clearly targeting me. Is this because of my age? Because I am young?" I said, "This is because you are a front desk employee at a hotel I own, and you told a guest with a disability that you did not want to deal with her. That guest was me." I watched the words hit her. Her expression collapsed. Benicio was brought in next. He shifted in his chair and said, "I was just making conversation. I did not mean anything by it." I said, "You told a guest that wheelchair guests are exhausting. In a hotel that charges $700 a night. In a hotel that carries my name." Benicio started to say he was sorry. I held up my hand and stopped him. I said, "The apology is not for me. It is for every guest you said that to before me, the ones who did not own the building." Bradford then informed Brielle and Benicio that their employment was terminated effective immediately. Caroline was told she was being placed on a performance improvement plan. Caroline looked at me and said, "Do I still have a job?" I said, "You have a chance to keep your job. That is more than you gave the guests who filed those complaints. After everyone left, I sat alone at that table for a few minutes. Bradford came back in and closed the door behind him. He said, "Are you okay?" I looked up at him and said, "I keep thinking about the 3 people who filed complaints before me. They did not have a company behind them. They just had a bad experience and nobody cared." Bradford pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. He looked me right in the eye and said, "They will care now." Over the following months, mandatory disability sensitivity training rolled out across all 140 properties. I stopped doing anonymous visits alone. I started showing up as myself, wheelchair and all, walking into lobbies with my name on the reservation and my company on the building. One morning, Bradford asked me why I changed my approach, and I told him, if they are going to treat disabled guests with respect, they should know a disabled woman built the whole thing.